It's Monday, the 17th of April, 2000, 6 a.m. 24-year-old Tomasz Komenda is standing in his parents' one-bedroom flat, where his family has lived for years. Him, his two brothers, his mom and stepdad. He's looking at the window frames, thinking they could use some fresh paint. He starts by putting tape where the glass meets the frame to prevent staining the windows with the white paint. He's almost done with taping when he hears loud noises and steps on the staircase. And then, bang. The entrance door to the flat gets wide open and pretty much destroyed by a group of police officers in bulletproof vests. Before he knows it, Tomasz Komenda is lying face down on the floor, with his arms on his back and handcuffs being put on his wrists. These window frames will not be painted for the next 18 years. And the tape will also stay there, exactly the way Tomasz put it. My name is Alex, and this is Poland Unveiled. First of all, I wanted to thank you guys for waiting for so long, both for the first episode of the Miłoszyce series as well as this one. You need to know that this podcast is my hobby, not my full-time job, unfortunately. And I can only give it as much time and attention as my everyday life and roaring procrastination allow me. Also, I want to let you know that I decided to divide this episode into 3 parts after all, simply because this episode number 2, would be about 3-4 hours long if I wanted to stick to my original plan. So for the patient ones, there will also be episode number 3. For those not so patient, I'm listing sources down below so that you can find out the ending of the story before I tell it, in case you're one of those people who have never heard of this case before. So, the last episode ended quite unexpectedly. As you may remember, one of the police officers in Wrocław received a work memo with information from his colleague that the killer of Małgosia Kwiatkowska was called Tomasz Komenda. Komenda was supposed to be Małgosia's ex-boyfriend and a sadist. You might think, no, what boyfriend? How come I never mentioned that Małgosia had a boyfriend in an over an hour-long episode? Well, it's because she didn't. At least not at the time of her death. Of course, we're talking about a 15-year-old girl who was interested in boys at that age. We might not know everything. However, she was quite sheltered by her parents. The only occasion she could potentially meet boys was at school. Her social life wasn't busy. We only know of 2 parties she attended. On the eve of St. Andrew's Day, which she got grounded for, and then the New Year's Eve party, where she met Krzysztof and spent the entire evening with him. When Małgosia died, her friends from school were interrogated, and one of them admitted that Małgosia might have been seeing someone shortly before her death because she brought a deodorant for men, apparently as a gift for St. Nick's, which is on the 6th of December. But who was this guy? If there was any, we never got to find out. The police never found him. However, in Ewa Wilczyńska's book, it's listed in the sources for the episode, it was clearly said that Małgosia was briefly going out with a boy from her neighborhood in December of 1996. Even though they had known each other for years, their relationship lasted for about a week or 2. Apparently, when Małgosia started to spend more time with her boyfriend, she realized that he was abusing alcohol. He was 18 at the time. And for that reason, she figured she didn't want to go out with him anymore. Besides, Małgosia seemed to have enjoyed spending time with her best friend, Iwona, much more than with her often drunk boyfriend and his friends. So she broke up with him, but we don't know when exactly, so maybe the deodorant was for him. But the important part of the story is that the boyfriend took the breakup quite well. There was no bad blood between them. They were still childhood friends and neighbors. So I just want to let you know that I wouldn't link that with that boy with Małgosia's death, and neither did the police, from what I know. So where did Tomasz Komenda come from in all this? Now, fasten your seatbelts, guys, because I'm taking you for a ride. And it may seem in the beginning that what I'm telling you now is completely unrelated to the topic, but be patient, it will all make sense. So this side of the story, the Tomasz Komenda side, also starts with a party. It wasn't a New Year's Eve party, like in Małgosia's case, but just a normal dinner party that took place somewhere in the autumn of 1999, almost 3 years after Małgosia died. There were 4 people at the dinner party. A police officer, his wife, it all happened in their apartment, the wife's old friend from college, and the friend's girlfriend. And the girlfriend's name was Dorota. According to Miss Dorota, the TV was on during the dinner party, and she managed to see a part of the program that covered the case of the murdered Małgosia Kwiatkowska. The speaker on TV probably said that up to that point, the police hadn't found the perpetrator, and then they showed the identities of men who could have been responsible for the girl's death. And I want to stop here for a moment because I'm not sure if those were the same identities that were made based on the descriptions given by the people of Miłoszyce, especially those people, those witnesses who saw the 2 young men taking Małgosia from the disco, or if the identities shown on TV were made later by someone else, maybe by the police officers in Wrocław. There's also quite a probable option number 3, that there were no identities shown on TV whatsoever, because there was no TV program covering the case of Miłoszyce at the time. Getting back to Miss Dorota. According to her, she saw the identities on TV, and she had an epiphany. She knew these men. They looked exactly like her elderly neighbor's grandsons. Depending on the source and different versions of what Miss Dorota would say to different journalists, she pointed either at 1, 2, or 3 men, but all related. It was either one grandson of her neighbor, or him and his older brother, or 2 brothers and their stepfather. Like I said, those versions would change. What happened next was that the police officer, the host of the party, passed the information on to his colleagues from the criminal department. My understanding is that he never worked on the case, but of course, he heard about it. What's worth mentioning, and I forgot to say it up until now, is that Miss Dorota lived in Wrocław. Like everything on the side of the story was happening in Wrocław, not in Jelczaskowice, where Małgosia and her parents lived, or in Miłoszyce, where the disco took place. So Miss Dorota pretty much said that, well, based on the TV program she allegedly saw and the identities displayed there, that it was someone from Wrocław, and over 600,000 residents at the time city, who went about 20-30 kilometers away on New Year's Eve to party at the cheapest disco in the village, and then assaulted and killed a 15-year-old girl there. In theory, it was possible, but was it true? To answer this question, you need to find out who Miss Dorota was. In 1999, she was in her late 30s. I believe she was born around 1960. She lived in a flat in Wrocław with her, let's call him, partner. It was quite a progressive relationship, if I may call it this way. That man was married, but because of work, he would spend some nights and days away from home, but apparently that wasn't too suspicious to his wife, who probably got used to it. Some of the time that the husband was supposed to be spending traveling for work, he obviously spent with his lover, Miss Dorota. It's worth noting that the flat they lived in with Miss Dorota was his company flat. I don't think that Dorota would ever mind that her partner was married and that she wasn't the only woman in his life. From what the couple's neighbors said about them, Miss Dorota was often seen with other men. And what's interesting, that those men weren't completely anonymous to the neighbors. They were police officers, prosecutors, and judges. Officially, Dorota worked at something like a social club for police officers only, where she was hired as a massage therapist, even though, as we know today, she wasn't in any way educated or certified to do such a job. It was gossiped that Dorota was simply a prostitute, and those police officers, prosecutors, and judges were in fact her clients. That would explain why Miss Dorota got a passport so easily in the times of deep communism. somewhere in the 80s here, when getting it and being allowed to leave the country was insanely hard, almost impossible in communist Poland. I think I might have already explained the passport situation in one of my previous episodes. It could have been one about Agnieszka Koldarska. You may want to check it out later. Anyways, Ms. Dorota was apparently a well-known person in the wide circles of the justice administration in Wrocław at the time. She would often be seen quite drunk, getting home late at night accompanied by different men. She was doing quite well financially. Her neighbors remembered her as a flamboyantly dressed woman with heavy makeup. The descriptions I read made me think of a Russian mafia woman, high heels, fur, golden jewelry, purple eyeshadow, this vibe. On the mafia note, I think Ms. Dorota equally couldn't have been considered a model citizen and an honest person. And I'm not saying this because of the relationship she was in or the unofficial job she had, if it was true that she was a prostitute. I'm saying this because in 1994, Dorota accused her partner of physical and mental abuse. The police and the prosecutor questioned her. An official investigation started, but also ended quite shortly because as it turned out, she had absolutely no proof that her partner ever laid his hand on her. What's more, on those days when she was supposed to be beaten particularly heavily, he was actually away for work. He wasn't even in Wrocław. I know what you might think, that it's not uncommon that the police don't believe the victim of abuse, that it often happens that the abusers get away scot-free with what they did, but I think this is not the case here. Firstly, Dorota was on very good terms with the local police, and even that didn't help her land her partner with domestic violence. Secondly, the DV allegation was the first, but not the last time, Dorota tried to get his partner in trouble. This company flat they lived in, she had absolutely no rights to it, but by forging her partner's signature, she first managed to officially register herself as a tenant of the flat, and then, without getting too deep into the legal situation of this flat, she tried to kick her partner out of it and to get herself a right to buy the flat out in the future. Once the partner realized that what she has done, he filed a case against her in court, and in 1997, Dorota was kicked out of her partner's flat. What happened to her next? Well, she must have moved, and at some point she started a family. She had a husband and at least one kid. One of Dorota's new neighbors was an elderly woman called Marianna. According to Ms. Dorota, Marianna's family didn't help her much in daily life, which is why it was Dorota who helped her elderly neighbor with groceries and stuff. Apparently, the two women became friends. Ms. Dorota would have a lot to say about Marianna's family later on, especially Marianna's daughter and grandsons. Apparently, the daughter, Teresa, was always drunk and would only visit her mother when she needed money. The family was constantly struggling to make ends meet, and the boys, Tomasz and Grzegorz, would come to their grandma's place to bring girls and party. Dorota also claimed that sometimes the boys would be cheeky enough to borrow money from her too. Dorota had the worst opinion about his family. She would call them all abnormal, especially Tomasz, who, according to Dorota, was slow. That's why, as she explained, it couldn't have been only Tomasz who went to Miłoszyce and killed Małgosia Kwiatkowska. Because, as you probably already realized, it was the two of Teresa's sons and their stepfather, who Ms. Dorota pointed out as the men portrayed in identikits shown on TV. According to Dorota, Tomasz wouldn't have been smart enough to commit the crime and managed to hide it for years. It must have been the three of them: Tomasz, his older brother Gerard, and their stepfather. Even though Tomasz was supposed to be slow, Ms. Dorota claimed that he managed to get himself a girlfriend, whom he talked about a lot with Dorota, as if they were almost friends. The girl's name was Małgosia, and she was a high school student from either Jelcz or Miłoszyce. Dorota wasn't sure. Because Tomasz was from Wrocław, he would have to commute to his girlfriend by train or bus, so he obviously needed money for the tickets and little gifts for his girlfriend. Sometimes he also borrowed money for gas, even though he didn't have a car or a driver's license. But as Dorota would say, he would borrow a car from his aunt from time to time. Dorota had all this information because even though she openly disdained Marianna's family, they would all see each other quite often. As I told you earlier, Dorota was doing well financially, and once she had a baby, she figured she could afford the nanny. Being the kind person that she was, Dorota offered a job to a struggling mom, Teresa, Marianna's daughter. The same Teresa who, as Dorota would later say to the prosecutor, was constantly drunk, never had any money, and would borrow it from her mother. The same Teresa who let her 2 sons organize parties at their elderly grandma's house. When asked by the prosecutor why Dorota let someone so obviously unfit for the job be a nanny to a toddler, Dorota replied that she struggled to find a good nanny and that Dorota was good enough. At least Dorota's baby always seemed happy and taken care of under Teresa's care. At some point, though, this blissful cooperation ended. Dorota said that she wanted to pay Teresa monthly wages, whereas Teresa wanted money daily. Miss Dorota claimed she couldn't pay Teresa or borrow her money every single day, and the nanny was dismissed after a few months. The 2 women weren't on good terms ever since, and the next time Teresa's family hears from Dorota again, it would be a few years later, after Dorota attends a dinner party at the police officer's place and sees the faces of Tomasz, Gerard, and their stepfather on TV. So, to sum this part up, because it might get tricky to see the timeline here. Once she got kicked out of her partner's flat, Miss Dorota moved and met a new neighbor, an elderly lady, Marianna. She also got to meet Marianna's family, and she had a bad opinion on them. Despite the bad opinion, Miss Dorota hired Marianna's daughter as a nanny. However, after a few months, the nanny was dismissed. A few years later, Miss Dorota attended a dinner party during which she saw a TV program about the murder of Małgosia Kwiatkowska, where she recognized the grandsons of Marianna and their stepfather, the identikit of the suspects. She told the host, the police officer, about it, and this is how the police found out about Tomasz Komenda. Now, did anyone in 1999 check that story? If this is true, if it makes any sense? Unfortunately, the answer is no. The prosecutor didn't see the reason to go deeper into Miss Dorota's life and her relationship with the family of Tomasz Komenda. We know now, it was checked by the journalists first and then the police, that there was no TV program covering the case of Małgosia Kwiatkowska in 1999. What's more, in Ewa Wilczyńska's book, I'm mentioning it again, it is said that the wife of the police officer who hosted the dinner party, now an ex-wife, claimed that they did not watch any TV that night and that they had a rule to never talk about work at home. And it seems that this rule was quite important to the wife. Maybe, and that's only my speculation, she didn't want to hear any gory details from her husband's job. That's why he wasn't allowed to talk about it. And also, the police job was probably not an acceptable topic at a dinner party with friends who were not with the police. Where's the truth then? Why did Miss Dorota claim she saw something she couldn't have seen, as we know now? Why lie? Especially when Miss Dorota got to see the brutal consequences of her lie. The entire Poland got to see them, and yet she never really took it back. I mean, maybe she tried, kind of. When the case was reopened, many years later, during a telephone call with a journalist, Miss Dorota said that she was never really 100% sure it was Tomasz, Gerard, and their stepfather, and that she told the police about it. She used the same argument as before, that Tomasz would be too slow, too stupid to do it himself, and since his brother and stepfather were exonerated, then Tomasz must have been innocent as well. Apparently, she said that to the police. You might also think, knowing the police's brutality in this case, that maybe Miss Dorota was forced to say something she wasn't so sure about in 1999, that maybe we shouldn't be so harsh with her. But before you start to feel sorry for the woman, let me tell you the story once again, but from a different perspective. Teresa Klemańska, the mother of Tomasz Komenda, who was one of the 3 men identified by Miss Dorota, she was 19 years old when she fell in love with the man she worked with. They got married, and then she got pregnant. Unfortunately, Teresa quickly realized that her husband was an abuser. The woman was beaten up even when she was heavily pregnant. She gave birth to her eldest son, Gerard, after which I presume the situation at home calmed down a bit, but not for long. And I think the situation calmed down, but I might be terribly wrong, because some time later, Teresa got pregnant once again. In her 3rd trimester, she got pushed down the stairs by her husband. Her father-in-law, knowing his son very well, told the young woman to run away because otherwise, one day, she might just not survive another attack. Teresa didn't wait until her labor. She left her husband before she gave birth, and Tomasz, her second son, was born when she was already more or less safe. I hope the situation already tells you how strong that woman was, or has been, because Mrs. Klemeńska is alive and well up to this day. She managed to escape an abusive relationship with a small child and another one on the way, and she never turned back, especially because she had to focus on her youngest son, who was born prematurely and with developmental issues, so to speak. As time went by, Teresa realized it would always take her son longer to learn new things, like sitting by himself or crawling. Later in life, he struggled at school with reading and writing. It's not like he wasn't able to learn, but he needed more time than other children. Teresa was very protective of her youngest son. She felt guilty about the fact she hadn't left her abusive husband earlier, because maybe if she had, she would have never been pushed down the stairs, and maybe Tomek would be like other kids. It breaks my heart she thought that. She couldn't have known that her husband might be able to do something like this. Plus, I think that one can't be 100% sure that Tomek's struggles were due to his mother's fall and his premature birth. Maybe he would be this way even if born full term. Maybe he was dyslexic or had ADHD. We don't know. Teresa would spend many hours with her son, helping him with homework. She would also encourage him to spend time outside, making new friends with neighbors' children. She would organize plays and competitions for all the children in the neighborhood, and it showed that Teresa was great with kids. A few years after Tomasz was born, Teresa met her now husband, Mirosław. This time it was different. Mirosław not only wasn't an abuser, but also treated Teresa's two boys like they were his own children. Gerard and Tomasz called him Dad. Mirosław and Teresa started a family, and two more children were born, brothers Krzysztof and then Piotr. It wasn't a rich family, 4 grown-up boys and 2 parents trying to make ends meet. However, Teresa always wanted to make sure that her children were loved and taken care of, since this was something she had lacked when she was a kid. She developed a strong bond with each of her children, but definitely the strongest one was with her second child, Tomasz. After one of her pregnancies, Teresa Klemeńska stayed at home with a newborn. I don't know what her work arrangements were at that point, if she had a job or was on maternity leave, or if she was a stay-at-home mom then. My guess would be the latter. So we have a family of 6 with only one income, and no wonder they needed money. That was the moment when Teresa was offered a job as a nanny by her mother's neighbor, Miss Dorota. Teresa and Dorota didn't know each other very well. However, Dorota was at Teresa's mom, Marianna, pretty much every day because Marianna would cook for her. Miss Dorota was so busy with her life that she figured she didn't have time to make her own food, so she paid her elderly neighbor for that. Every day, Dorota would come to Marianna's flat to either eat or pick up her dinner. When Miss Dorota found out that Teresa was staying at home with her baby, she asked if Teresa wanted to make some money watching her, Dorota's son, as well. Teresa agreed to watch the boy from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. on weekdays. At first, everything went smoothly, but after a while, this whole babysitting business lasted for about 6 months, Miss Dorota started to pick her son up later and later at night, like 6 p.m., then even 10 p.m. She even proposed that the kids stay at Teresa's for the entire week, and Miss Dorota would pick the boy up only for the weekends. Teresa said no. When Dorota's son got sick once and Teresa had no way of contacting Dorota by phone, there were no cell phones available at the time, she went to Dorota's workplace. I believe it must have been this club for police officers when she officially worked as a massage therapist, to let her know that the baby is sick and maybe should be taken to a doctor, or at least be isolated from Teresa's kids for their safety. Miss Dorota brushed her nanny off and told her that unless the kid was dying, she didn't want to be bothered. Teresa saw that the boy wasn't properly taken care of, at least emotionally. She was very sensitive about this, still remembering her own childhood and a cold home she was raised in, and she didn't want to see any child feeling unloved. That, of course, first and foremost pertained to her own children, but also to this little boy that she was babysitting for Dorota. But the true rupture between the two women, Teresa and Dorota, happened before Teresa's name day. I'm guessing you're wondering what the heck I'm talking about. What name day? So, from Wikipedia, which explains this excellently, Name day is a day of the year associated with one's baptismal name, which is normatively that of a biblical character or other saint. The custom originated with the Christian calendar of saints. Believers named after a saint would celebrate that saint's feast day. So in Poland, we celebrate birthdays and name days. In some regions, name days are considered even more important than birthdays. I guess it makes sense for some ladies who don't want to admit how old they are anymore, and in order not to miss out on a party, they celebrate their name day instead of their birthday. Anyways, Teresa wanted to throw a little party on her name day, and because of that, she told Miss Dorota that her son would not be babysat on that day and evening because a baby shouldn't be present at the party due to alcohol consumption, late hours, and so on. Simply that this was not an environment for a toddler to be in, which I find very responsible because there will be many parents, especially in the 90s, who wouldn't care. Miss Dorota got very mad at her nanny. According to Teresa, the conversation got very heated very quickly and resulted in Teresa saying that she quit. She wouldn't be babysitting Dorota's son anymore. At which point, Miss Dorota hissed at Teresa that she would regret this and that one day she would be crying because of Dorota. When Mrs. Teresa Klemańska tells this story in interviews, after this day, her voice shakes when she remembers that moment, that argument. And she always adds, "I was crying indeed. I was crying for 18 years because of that woman." I understand that this might not seem like a valid or believable reason. I mean, refusing to babysit on one particular day to pretty much destroy the life of an entire family, but trust me, the history of crime does know cases when people would do most horrible things out of pure spite, jealousy, or, and I will tell you about this particular case one day, it just takes a lot of preparation, because of cheap glassware rented for a wedding reception. Yes, I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's a true story, and one of the most disgusting ones you'll ever hear on this channel. Getting back to Ms. Dorota and her relationship with the Klemański family. And by the way, I'm using Klemański and Komenda names. This is because Komenda was Teresa's surname after her first husband, which is why her two oldest sons also had the surname. When Teresa remarried, she changed her last name to Klemańska, and that's why the two younger boys have different names than their older brothers. So, getting back to their relationship, there might be one more reason why Ms. Dorota held a grudge against this family. However, I only found one mention about this in a newspaper and couldn't find any more information about this elsewhere. In one of her interviews, Teresa Klemańska said that her mother, Marianna, the one that was Ms. Dorota's neighbor, testified in court against Ms. Dorota, and it was before Ms. Dorota told the police that in her opinion, it was Gerard, Tomasz, and their stepfather who attacked and killed Małgosia Kwiatkowska. However, like I said, it was only mentioned once in the story, and I have absolutely no idea what the court case was about, what exactly Marianna said in court, and if it could make Ms. Dorota so mad that she decided to slander 3 innocent people and never back down, even though she must have seen the consequences of what she had done. Admittedly, being spiteful because of losing a case in court seems to me like a slightly more, I don't want to say valid, but probable reason why this whole situation has happened. So we have 2 different pictures of who Ms. Dorota was. The one she presented by herself, of an abuse victim, a massage therapist, then a wife and a mother who saw something on TV and told the police about it, even though, allegedly, she wasn't so sure she was pointing at the right people. She also said she was a caring neighbor for Marianna and a helping hand for the Klemański family, despite the fact she thought less of them, considered them a bunch of alcoholics, especially Teresa, and felt like they were using her, borrowing money she knew they would never give back, and so on. On the other hand, we have a picture portrayed by her ex-partner, a prosecutor, and police officers who interrogated her, her former neighbors, acquaintances, and so on, also by Teresa Klemańska. Oddly enough, we have no comments from the police officer who was Dorota's friend and passed the information on Tomasz Komenda on to his colleagues in the criminal department. We have a picture that says that Miss Dorota was seen with prominent members of the local legislature and the police very often, mostly late at night and drunk, and she would spend nights with them. She was also quite well off despite having no formal education, no business of her own, just by being a massage therapist but for the police officially. The picture that says she was an unfaithful partner and a thief, then possibly not the best mother if it's true that she was okay with leaving her toddler with strangers for a week. And then years later, based on the interrogations, polygraph tests, and psychological assessments, Ms. Dorota was also found to be an unreliable witness with narcissistic tendencies, prone to confabulation, and trying to portray herself as a victim. Also, fun fact about her, during one of her interrogations with the prosecutor, she complained that even though the murderer was caught and the case was officially solved, she never got the prize money, despite the fact that she was the one who provided the information that finally allowed closing the case. If it makes you feel any better, she never got this money. So how is this even possible that someone believed her? How is this possible that her words, well, of course, not her words only, but we'll get to the rest of the evidence shortly, how is this possible that it led to sentencing someone to many, many years in prison? I believe many factors contributed to this outcome. First, the pressure on the case. It was still an unresolved, brutal murder of a teenage girl. And even though the prosecutor tried to close the case, not even once, the parents of Małgosia, along with their lawyer, did everything they could to make the police continue their search. Also, parents of other kids, well, the community of Wielczyn and Miłoszyce, scared for their kids, wanted to see the person responsible for the murder behind bars. But that pressure was nothing in comparison with the pressure coming from the very top, and I mean the government here. It sounds like a good thing, right? Just like the thing that case and many other needed. Well, many people thought so too, but as you will see, too much pressure and the rush that comes with it may lead to a miserable outcome. In June of 2000, which is about 8 months after the famous dinner party with Ms. Dorota, Lech Kaczyński was appointed both the Minister of Justice and Attorney General. These are joint offices in Poland, which in my opinion is a huge mistake. The new Minister/Attorney General was already quite a well-known person in Polish politics, along with his twin brother, Jarosław. Both child actors, both lawyers, both very into politics. In 2001, they even started their own political party that is still up and running up to this day. And Lech's brother, Jarosław, is one of the most recognizable, or some might even say notorious, politicians in Poland today. Lech Kaczyński, who died in a plane crash in 2010, along with his wife and about half of the Polish government at the time, will be remembered for at least a few things, one of which is him becoming the president of the Republic of Poland in 2005, but also for the fact that in times when, as I explained it to you earlier, the crime rate was sky high and there was almost no money for the police to properly fight it, he said, enough is enough, and started clearing the prosecution offices all over the country from the prosecutors that, in his mind, were too forbearing or too lazy, or simply those who did not share his no mercy for criminals policy. He would leave clear instructions to his prosecutors on how to approach criminal cases. Arresting suspects for at least 3 months was supposed to be a new standard, with the possibility of prolonging the arrest if necessary before even any sentence was made in the case, just to keep a potentially dangerous person off the streets. As the Minister of Justice, Lech Kaczyński promised to raise prison sentences in the Polish criminal code because the code treated crimes too mildly. Prosecutors would ask for even lower sentences, and the judges would make the final decision of usually the lowest sentence possible. As you may imagine, society loved the minister's new, harsher approach. Everyone was sick and tired of hearing about new murders, mafia wars, teenagers attacking random people on the streets out of boredom, so the fact that there was someone actually willing and able to do something about this must have felt like such a relief. But not for everyone. And I don't mean the criminals here. The fact that Lech Kaczyński started to fill prosecution offices with people who 100% shared his mindset caused panic among those who wanted to stay in those offices and feared that they might simply get fired if they didn't deliver, so to speak. which wasn't an irrational fear. Some people caved and decided to be obedient. Some went a little further, worked a little harder, in order to show the new boss that they were reliable and trustworthy under the new no mercy policy. When Lech Kaczyński became the Minister of Justice and Attorney General, the lawyer of Małgosia Kwiatkowska's parents requested an appointment with him, which happened somewhere in the summer of 2000, shortly after Kaczyński was nominated. They spoke about the case, and the minister was shocked and disgusted with the crime, but also incredibly frustrated with the progress, or rather lack of thereof, in the investigation. He demanded full file access from the prosecution office in Wrocław, got to know the case in detail, and used this case to justify reorganizing the entire Wrocław office. He handed the investigation over to a new prosecutor, a former spokesperson of the office, then fired the chief of the entire prosecution office. Kaczyński didn't say he was unhappy with the chief prosecutor, but branded this move as an attempt to raise the effectiveness of the office, whatever that meant. In April of 2001, those events led to the first person to ever be committed for trial in this case, over 4 years after Małgosia died. But if someone was put on trial, then there had to be a proper suspect, proper evidence material, after a proper 4 years investigation, right? Now, to sum it all up, we have a woman from nowhere who knew police officers and had a vendetta against a family she disliked. Now let's combine it with the police's and prosecution's urge to finally solve the case of Małgosia Kwiatkowska, the urge caused by pressure from the Attorney General, and we have a recipe for disaster. On a side note, it was later speculated that Ms. Dorota was probably paid in some form. It didn't necessarily have to be money for what she testified. That conclusion was drawn many years later when Ms. Dorota eventually underwent a polygraph test. It didn't go well. Now, let me walk you step by step through the chain of events. We're going back to November of 1999, when one of the police officers in Wrocław Criminal Department created a memo in which he stated that he had received information from another officer that Małgorzata Kwiatkowska could have been killed by a man called Tomek, her ex-boyfriend and a sadist. Now you know where this information came from. Ms. Dorota gave it to her police officer friend at a dinner party, allegedly based on the TV program and an identikit displayed there. Once the police had established the address and other personal details, and the Komenda family found out that they had been linked with by the police with a murder case, the next step was searching through their flat, as the prosecutor hoped that he would find Małgosia's missing shoes or jewelry. The search took place on the 16th of November 1999, and on that day, Tomasz Komenda was also taken into custody for 48 hours. It doesn't mean that anything was found in the apartment. It only meant that the prosecutor wanted to have the suspect at his disposal, and in the 90s, it was possible for the prosecutor to pretty much arrest anyone for 48 hours. Today it's not that easy, since it has to be a court decision, but it's still terrifying. The entire family was quite shocked by what was happening, but they were trying to stay calm, since they knew that this was all a horrible mistake. None of them had even ever been to Miłoszyce village. They had nothing to do with the murder that they, of course, had heard of. On the day of his arrest, Tomasz Komenda was interrogated by the exact same police officer who interrogated Krzysztof, the boy who spent the New Year's Eve party with Małgosia and was the last known person who saw her alive before she was taken away by her freak brother. As you remember, that police officer managed to make Krzysztof confess that on the night of the 31st of December 1996, Krzysztof and Małgosia had sex on the yard of the Jar family. When Krzysztof was released from custody, the first thing his father had to do was take his son to the hospital, where Krzysztof was diagnosed with brain edema after a severe beating. That police officer, along with his colleague who was also present during the interrogation, knew that Tomasz Komenda didn't really match the profile of a brutal rapist and a killer. Komenda had never been in prison, never been accused of any sort of sexual violence. He came from a completely normal, average family, and it was confirmed by the community policeman that there had never been any interventions or domestic violence reports in this family, no alcohol abuse. The family was known and liked in its neighborhood, especially Mrs. Klemańska. The only person to have ever said anything bad about Komenda or his family was Miss Dorota. It was her words that brought the police's attention to this family. And instead of verifying her testimony, the police started to tailor the probable version of events to her words. The first interrogation of Tomasz Komenda from the fall of 1999 was still quite civilized, though. Tomasz answered questions about his home and family. He was asked if he ever partied, went to a disco, and if so, where it was. Tomasz answered that yes, sometimes he would go out with his brothers, and it would be in his neighborhood. Then the police asked if Komenda drove, and the answer was no, because Tomasz didn't have a car or a driver's license. What about his brothers? Yes, 2 brothers had their driver's license. One had it for cars, the other for trucks, but none of them had a car too. Tomasz said that in cases they ever needed a car, they would borrow one from one of their mates. What car was it? A beetroot red Fiat 126P, probably the most popular model of a car in Poland in the 90s. Then Tomasz was asked directly if he had ever been to Jelcz or Miłoszyce, to which he replied that no, he never needed to go there. Did he know if his brothers went there? No, he didn't know. He couldn't tell, but he knew they didn't have any family in those places. They would never go there to see any friends or cousins, nothing like that. Komenda was then interrogated about the New Year's Eve of 1996, almost 3 years after it happened. He recalled having spent it with his family and friends at home. They started celebrations at about 9 p.m. and finished about 6 a.m. the next morning. However, he remembered he drank too much that night and didn't last till the end, went to sleep about 1 a.m. Komenda remembered leaving the apartment once, with everyone else, at midnight, to watch fireworks. Tomasz was also asked about girls in his life, if he had a girlfriend, to which Tomasz replied that no, he didn't have a girlfriend, because one broke up with him about 2 weeks before the interrogation. This is more or less what the first interrogation was like. After that, Tomasz was asked if he consented to have a sample of his blood drawn for DNA test purposes, and he had no problem with that, so the DNA test could have been taken without issues. A few days later, Tomasz's older brother, Gerard, was also interrogated and asked more or less the same questions as Tomasz. The only difference between their testimonies was regarding the night of New Year's Eve of 1996, because Gerard actually did leave the apartment at some point during the party, unlike his younger brother. Gerard and his friend called a taxi and accompanied their 2 female friends on their way home, then came back to the party in the same taxi, and this whole thing took less than an hour. Gerard confirmed he didn't have a car back then. He also confirmed he'd never been to Jelcz or Miłoszyce, for he had no business going there. He didn't know anyone in those places. The third brother and the parents were also interrogated about the same thing. The only brother that was not called to the police station at the time was a toddler. And the entire family testified the same way. Of course, it wasn't surprising to the police. Since they were a family, they could have created and memorized the same version of events to protect themselves. That's why the police asked for a list of friends who attended the New Year's Eve party in 1996, and all 8 of them were found and interrogated as well. Their testimonies were all the same, at least in the part that confirmed that Tomasz Komenda spent the entire evening with them, got drunk, and went to sleep early, which was kind of expected, as many said, because Tomasz was known for his absolute lack of immunity when it comes to alcohol. Of course, witnesses' testimonies were not enough for the police to exonerate someone, which is understandable, and which is why they had to collect more evidence. I have already mentioned that they took a sample of blood from Tomasz Komenda to compare it with the DNA found at the crime scene. The DNA came from a few hairs found in the black hat lying either next to or under Małgosia's body. On the 26th of November 1999, the results came back, and it turned out some DNA markers from the hairs matched the DNA profile of Tomasz Komenda, but not his brothers or stepfather. Now that was something. That was a lot. It was a DNA test, right? 100% solid, as it seemed. But let me remind you, that the DNA test was taken using the same old polymarker method, which only allowed comparing 6 markers and didn't use any computer for analysis, only the technician's eyes. And the same 6 markers could have been found in many other people's DNA, as sources say. At that point, Tomasz Komenda was still not arrested and had absolutely no idea that his life was about to change forever. His and his family's. A few days after the DNA results came back, Tomasz and his brother's jaw casts were made to compare their teeth arrangements with prints left on Małgosia's body. And even though, as you may remember, the pictures of the said prints were taken from a wrong angle, which we'll officially find out about later, and the forensic rollers were put too far from the prints, so the proportions of the pictures were distorted, the court expert, after a few months' wait, was able to determine in 2000 that the bite marks left on Małgosia's body came either from Komenda's teeth or other person's teeth whose lower jaw was very similar to Komenda's. Because you need to know that only the lower jaw was tested and compared. The upper jaw was, for some unknown to me reason, not checked. In the meantime, the police went through the list of attendees of the New Year's Eve party in 1996 in the Alcatraz disco and called them all in order to show them the pictures of Tomasz, Gerard, Krzysztof, and one of Irek's, the one who left his bike and bottles of alcohol at the R family's yard where Małgosia's body was found. None of these men was recognized by party attendees. However, we have to keep in mind that those pictures were shown to witnesses almost 3 years after the party. And since it was the cheapest disco in the area, I believe probably a couple of hundred people was there, most of them drunk, so no wonder that nobody could remember if they saw Tomasz, his brothers, or Irek. Krzysztof, the boy who spent the party with Małgosia, also did not recognize any of the suspects as a man who took Małgosia from the party as her brother. 3 years is a long time, especially when you're young and, for example, transition from a teenager to a young adult. Everything can change. Your face, facial hair, hairstyle, even height or weight. To me, showing those pictures to witnesses in 1999 was simply pointless. When I think about it, I'm not sure I could recognize every single person present at the New Year's Eve party last year, and it was only, 6 months ago? And there were only about a dozen people there, and trust me, I wasn't stiff drunk. Before the jaw print expertise arrived, the police officers figured they could make use of the hat left on the crime scene once again, this time for scent purposes. The hat was put in a jar by the forensic technicians on the day when Małgosia's body was found. On the 9th of March, 2000, the police officers took Tomek to the police station about a 2-hour drive away from Wrocław, to Głogów, because this is where the K9 officers were waiting, along with their handler. What's interesting is that Komenda was not told where he was going with the officers and what for. He found out in Głogów what tests they would be carrying out that day, and my question is, why the conspiracy? I think I know the answer, but let's not spoil the rest of the story for you. The test was simple. Komenda was asked to hold a cotton pad for 15 minutes, kind of rubbing the scent of his hand into the cotton. Then the same thing was done by 4 other people, not in any way linked with the case, just to create a control group. Then the preserved cotton pads with the scent were taken to a different room where 2 dogs were waiting. First, the dogs were offered to smell the piece of evidence, in this case the black hat, found at the crime scene. Once this was done, each dog was allowed to proceed to each of the cotton pads with the smells of the suspect and the control group. Even the dog handler didn't know which jar contained the smell of the suspect. The test was carried out at least 3 times by each dog. Plus, there was also something called an empty trial, where the smell of the suspect was not presented to the dogs at all. And guess what? Both dogs recognized the smell of Tomasz Komenda as the one present in the hat found at the crime scene. Bingo. That was it. That was all the police needed, and more. They had the DNA, they had the smell, they had the jaw print. But maybe at least one witness testimony would make everything look 100% solid. So here she comes, this time officially, Miss Dorota and her testimony, on the 10th of April 2000. She got to speak with the lead investigator, the aggressive one, who liked sending his suspects to the hospital after interrogations. But she wasn't a suspect. She was helping him, so maybe he was nicer to her. Miss Dorota didn't say anything we wouldn't already know. She recalled some situations that were supposed to prove that the family of Tomasz Komenda was disturbed or abnormal. There's always the story she would recall about meat. I don't know why, but it stuck with me, maybe because I read it so many times. So Miss Dorota said that she once asked Marianna, the mother of Teresa Klemańska, to buy 5 kilos of minced meat for Dorota and to keep it in her fridge so that Dorota could collect it later when she's back from work. And when she came home from work and popped into Marianna's to get the meat, she discovered that all 5 kilos were gone. When Marianna realized that Dorota saw that the meat is gone, then, according to Dorota, the elderly woman started crying and said that Teresa and the kids had visited earlier, which Miss Dorota took as confirmation that all 5 kilos of minced meat had been eaten in one day by a mother and her 2 kids, or taken home by them. The situation, if it actually happened, must have hurt her so bad that she would recall it every time she talked about the Komenda family, and she felt obliged to tell it to the police when questioned on the case of the brutal rape and murder of a teenage girl. Mincemeat Gate. Miss Dorota said, once again, that the members of the Komenda family would borrow money from her all the time and never pay it back. The prosecutor showed her pictures of Tomasz, his brother, and the stepfather, and she confirmed that these were the people she was talking about. The prosecutor then said for the record that Tomasz Komenda was in picture number 2, to which Miss Dorota immediately added that it was he who would borrow money from her most often. What was the money for? Tomasz would allegedly say that for flowers for his fiancée. On that note, in Poland, the generation of our grandparents wouldn't really use the words like boyfriend or girlfriend to refer to a partner one is not married to, which is why fiancé or fiancée were used. In this case, it doesn't mean that Dorota was implying that a 15-year-old girl was engaged to a 20-year-old at the time Komenda. She was simply using an old-fashioned term for a girlfriend. Miss Dorota claimed that the money was for flowers and bus tickets to either Jelcz or some village nearby. Maybe she tried to make sure that she somehow geographically covered Miłoszyce in her testimony, too, even though Małgosia didn't live there. According to Tomek, the girl was going to school in Wrocław, and they would meet in town from time to time as well. It was later discovered that one of Tomek's brother's girlfriend was going to the same high school as Małgosia, which the police took as another nail in his coffin. By the way, the girls weren't even going to the same class. They were in the same age. I think Dorota was surprised to hear that Tomek's girlfriend was going to high school, as opposed to Tomek himself, because this lovely woman didn't hesitate to ask whether the girl Tomasz was dating was, I quote, also a retard, just like Tomek, in which case it would be weird if she went to a normal school for normal kids, right? Swear to God, the more I'd say about this woman, the more I despise her. Tomek confirmed that his girl was not a retard, that she was normal. Miss Dorota also shared with the police that many times she saw Tomasz and his brothers bring girls to their grandma's flat, and when that was happening, Marianna had to leave her home because the boys would tell her to. Apparently, they wanted to party without their grandma present, which was incredibly disrespectful. Just as disrespectful was the way the brothers would call their female companions and treat them. Miss Dorota felt too shy and embarrassed to even mention the adjective they would use for the girls. I'm wondering, how come that woman saw, apparently many times, that the boys were bringing girls to their grandma's flat when Miss Dorota was absent most of the time, too busy to make meals for herself or take care of her own baby, who, as you remember, she wanted to stay at Klemański family for an entire week so that she could only pick her son up for the weekend. And given her neighbors' testimonies, she would often be seen out and drunk with different men each night. Hence, my understanding of the situation is that she only slept in her flat. Yet she managed to have elaborate conversations with her neighbors, their grandsons, observe the family's habits, lend them money, and establish an overall negative opinion about Teresa and her sons. An opinion that, by the way, nobody else who knew the Klemański family shared. Getting back to the rest of her first official interrogation, Ms. Dorota repeated the information she gave to her police officer friend, that during a dinner party in the autumn of 1999, she saw a part of a TV program 997, as she called it, and recognized Tomasz, Gerard, and their stepfather in the drawings of potential suspects. She got the name of the program slightly wrong, or maybe she just shortened it because the true crime program she was probably referring to, very popular at the time, was called Magazyn Kryminalny 997, which translates more or less into Criminal Magazine or Crime Magazine 997. 997 was an official old emergency number for the police. These days it's 112 for all emergency services. But as I already told you, many years later, people started to check if Ms. Dorota's story of seeing this program could be true, and breaking news, it wasn't. There was no TV program covering the Miłoszyce case at the time, maybe even that year, and it definitely wasn't the Magazyn Kryminalny 997. But to the lead investigator and the prosecutor, it didn't matter. They got everything they wanted and more. A suspect, a few pieces of solid, as it seemed, evidence, and a witness testimony. They were ready to go. Tomasz Komenda, still having no idea at the time what was about to happen, still not informed about the results of all the tests he underwent, lived a normal, happy life. He found a nice girlfriend, he had a job he enjoyed and was good at. He worked in a car wash next to the main railway station in Wrocław. He was hardworking and diligent. He was often requested by the customers to be the person who cleaned their cars because he did it so well. On the 17th of April 2000, at about 6-7 a.m., Tomasz Komenda was eventually arrested in his parents' flat, the one he was renovating, on suspicion of brutally sexually assaulting Małgorzata Kwiatkowska, which resulted in her death on the night of the 31st of December 1996 and the 1st of January 1997. At first, his family didn't even know he was arrested. Since the place was getting renovated, Tomek's mom and stepdad moved to their relative's apartment for a few weeks. It was the neighbors who told Mrs. Klemeńska that her son was handcuffed and taken into custody that morning. She immediately went to the police station, but of course, they didn't let her see her son. To let him know he was not alone and that she was waiting outside, Mrs. Klemeńska asked the police officers to pass on a pack of cigarettes for Tomasz, with his name handwritten by her on the back. In the interrogation room, the lead investigator, the aggressive one, and his colleagues started questioning Tomasz about the night of the 31st of December 1996. This interrogation was, of course, different than the one from November 1999, when Tomasz was arrested for 48 hours and the police were only starting to look for evidence to prove he had something to do with the death of Małgorzata Kwiatkowska. 5 months later, they had the results of the DNA test, the jaw print comparison, and a confirmation that the smell in the hat from the crime scene belonged to Tomasz. They weren't shooting in the dark anymore. They were absolutely sure that Komenda was lying, which made the police officers even more angry than the first time around. Because he still wasn't saying what they wanted to hear, he stuck to his version of spending New Year's Eve of 1996 in Wrocław with his friends and family. But all the police wanted to hear was for him to admit that he, in fact, left town that night and preferably went somewhere close to Miłoszyce. But Komenda was stubborn. So then the beating started. Beating, cursing, breaking furniture literally on the suspect's head. Beating so severe that when Tomasz Komenda was asked about this many years later in an interview, he said, "If they asked me to tell them that I killed the Pope, I would have confessed to that." The officers threw pictures of Małgosia's massacred body in front of Tomasz and made him look at them, yelling, "Look at what you did to her." When that session of interrogation was over, Tomasz got locked up in his cell. The next day, the investigators took him to the interrogation room again, but this time, they had a written statement ready to be signed by Tomasz, with a version of events that maybe wasn't perfect, maybe didn't fit the exact chain of events, but at least it proved that Tomasz Komenda was in Miłoszyce on the night of the 31st of December 1996. That written statement, if signed by Komenda and this way confirmed as his true words, combined with evidence collected so far, the DNA, jaw print, the smell, was more than enough to put Tomasz Komenda on trial. So what was in that statement? Meaning, what was the police's version of what happened? So the first few hours of the night were exactly as Komenda described them. At about 9 p.m., everyone gathered in the flat to celebrate New Year's Eve. They had alcohol, Tomek as well, but not so much as she would go to sleep early. At midnight, everyone left the flat to watch the fireworks for about 10 minutes with the neighbors, then went back to the flat and continued the party. Then, at about 2 a.m., Tomek got bored and decided to leave his friends and family and go to Gajków. Gajków is a village about 18 kilometers away from Wrocław, and apparently, Tomek figured he would go there because his car wash co-worker lived there. And they met in Gajków once to play a football match with the locals, so Tomek knew that place a bit and thought that maybe he and his colleague could party together this time. So on New Year's Eve night, Tomek took a tram, then a bus, and within an hour, so at about 3 a.m., he got to Gajków. He didn't remember his friend's exact address, so he stated that the friend lived somewhere near the church. When he got to his friend's house, he found out that there was a disco in Miłoszyce, and both men decided to go there. Literally go, on foot. Miłoszyce is about 12 kilometers away from Gajków, and according to police, it only took Tomasz and his colleague half an hour to get to the disco. When both were drunk, it was the middle of a very frosty night with snow on the ground and so on. Half an hour, so it was already about 3:30 a.m. When they got to the disco, Tomek's colleague didn't like it there that much and left after about half an hour, so we had 4 a.m. But Tomek didn't stay along for long because he met a girl at the party. Her name was Kasia. That's short for Katarzyna. And then in the statement, because bear in mind this is all written statement prepared by the police, there was a short and vague description of Kasia's looks. They partied together until the disco ended. It didn't say when it ended, but when the party was over, Tomek and his new female acquaintance didn't go home, but went to the nearest forest instead to have sex on the frozen ground and in the dark. It's the second time that this aggressive lead investigator tried to convince someone they had sex outside in winter in some completely random place. Like, it's so creepy to me. Was it his own sexual fantasy? What? Anyways, in the statement, it was said that Kasia wanted to have sex with Tomek, that it was consensual for both parties. After that, they both went home. Tomek again walked about half an hour to Gajków, and from there he took a bus to Wrocław and got home at about 6 or 6:30 a.m. Everyone at home saw him get back from his little trip. Nobody asked him any questions, and Tomek, completely unbothered, went to sleep after a long night. Should I ruin this whole version now or wait until the trial? Maybe I'll do it now, because there will be plenty to talk about in regard to the trial. So first of all, public transport on any New Year's Eve night. Good luck with that. There were no trams or buses available that night that could possibly get Tomasz to Gajków. I don't even think that the tram that in the city center that he was supposed to take to get to the bus station was operating. Because it's New Year's Eve, and everyone wants to celebrate. If the police officers had made some effort, they could have checked the timetables and found out that there was no transport available for Tomasz that night. He couldn't have taken a bus to go anywhere. Second, the reason why he went to Gajków, of all places. The police figured he had a friend or a colleague there. Was it true? Not as of 1996, because Tomek knew at least one person from Gajków. His boss, the owner of the car wash where Tomek worked for a few months before he got arrested. But he was arrested in 1999, and it was in 1999 when he met his boss, not 1996. What's more, they weren't friends. Their relationship was strictly professional. They weren't even on a first-name basis. And definitely, his boss would not be a person Tomasz would go to, drunk, in the middle of the night, even on New Year's Eve, and ask him to go to a disco together, as friends. Besides, the boss was over 30 at the time, and Tomek was like a decade younger. Next, the math isn't mathing. I mean the times of events. If Tomek left his flat at about 2 a.m. and got to Gajków within an hour, even if we were to assume that there was public transport available, then he must have been at his colleague's place at 3 a.m. or shortly after. They talk, make plans, let's say it's 3:30 a.m. when they leave Gajków and go to Miłoszyce. To get there within half an hour, as the police assumed, they would both have to run really fast. Assuming that an average person's walking pace is 5 kilometers per hour, and the distance between Gajków and Miłoszyce is 12-13 kilometers, depending on the route, it should take them over 2 hours to get there. And again, it was winter, dark, cold, snow on the ground. They didn't take a car. They didn't even take a made-up bus this time. They were supposed to walk. But okay, let's only add half an hour. It was 4 a.m. when they got to the disco. Wondering if it made any sense. The party was surely dying at that hour. Tomek's colleague leaves after half an hour at 4:30 a.m. Then Tomek meets Kasia. They stay till the end, let's say 5 a.m. Then they go to the forest, which, by the way, doesn't exist on the maps, but who knows, maybe there was something like that in 1986. How long could it take Tomek and Kasia to find a cozy place and then have sex? Another half an hour? Minus 20 degrees Celsius? Would be dreadful even if they found a barn or something. So it's 5:30 a.m. Then the couple says goodbye to each other, and Tomek heads back to Gaikov again. It should take him about 2 hours to get there, but to the police it was no more than 30 minutes on foot. It's 6 a.m. Assuming that the first bus of the new year 1997 arrives at Gaikov at 6 a.m. sharp, and Tomek doesn't have to wait for it. Then, again, he doesn't have to wait for a tram. He's supposed to be home an hour later, at about 7 a.m. The police stated he should be home and going to sleep at 6 a.m. Even if we somehow agreed that there was public transport available, the journey from and to Gaikov took half an hour, and Tomek didn't have to wait for buses or trams. It still doesn't add up. And it doesn't add up even more when we know there was no public transport available, and that it would have taken him much longer to walk from one village to another. Plus, we can't really tell how long he would actually spend at the disco and what time exactly he left the house and got to Miłoszyce. Plus, this weird thing about meeting a random girl at the disco and then having sex with her outdoors. What was that about? To have Komenda admit he went to the Alcatraz disco and had sex somewhere in Miłoszyce? To point out that in the beginning he denied even going there, then changed his mind, and then hoped that he would eventually admit that the girl's name wasn't Kasia, but Małgosia, and that the sex wasn't consensual? Some holes in this entire story were filled up by Miss Dorota's testimony. That woman was interrogated more than once, and it looks as if whatever was lacking in Tomek's story, real or made up by the police officers, whatever didn't make sense, it would be made right compiled with Miss Dorota's words that worked like a jigsaw, with the official version that suited the police best. For example, Miss Dorota testified that it was in the autumn of 1996 when Tomek bragged that he was seeing a high school student from Miłoszyce or Jelcz, and that the bragging and borrowing money ended after New Year's, 1997. The same on New Year's Eve. Tomek wanted to borrow gas money, and Miss Dorota thought it was cheeky of him to borrow money for gas when he didn't have a car, to which he replied that his aunt lent him a car, and he was gonna drive it to Miłoszyce. Dorota demanded Tomek show her said car, and according to her, he pointed at one of the cars in the parking lot outside a block of flats. It was of light color, so specific. What's interesting is that we know that a white Fiat was seen driving around Miłoszyce that night. I also found information that a silver Audi was of police interest in regard to this case. At the same time, they had Ms. Dorota's testimony and still insisted that Tomek used public transport to get to Miłoszyce on the 31st of December. So which one was it? A tram and a bus combo? Or a car borrowed from Tomek's aunt? Or maybe both, just to be sure. They picked and chose whatever they could use from Dorota's testimony, not even paying attention to the fact that some pieces contradicted one another. Plus, Tomasz couldn't drive. His brother and stepfather almost laughed when asked about Tomek's driving skills. They both said they tried to teach him, but he had absolutely zero eye-to-limb coordination. When he had to focus on changing gears, he would forget to look at the road, not to mention paying attention to other cars, people, road signs and stuff. It was too much for him, so everyone thought it was better he didn't even try anymore, because it would be dangerous. The police tried to convince Tomasz to sign his fake statement, not only by beating him, but also by promising that he would eventually get to see his mother and maybe even leave custody. So he eventually signed it, because he wanted to see his mom. But instead of his mother's visitation, what he got was a set of handcuffs on his wrists and a ride to remand prison when he spent the next 18 months waiting for his trial. The police were happy. The case had a chance to be closed. The prosecutor would celebrate not only finding a murderer, but also proving his worth to the new Minister of Justice / Attorney General. And the parents of Małgosia Kwiatkowska are relieved that the murderer of their daughter would eventually be put in prison. What's interesting is that not long after Tomasz Komenda was arrested, one of the prosecutors in this case, the prosecutor number 4, also got arrested. It didn't have anything to do with the Miłoszyce case. At least I didn't find such information. But the fact that this prosecutor liked going to brothels, which looked bad enough, but was not a crime in itself. It was more about who paid for the sex worker's services, and it wasn't a prosecutor, but some gangsters he was friends with. And sponsoring his brothel trips was a form of bribery. I told you that the 90s were a golden time for the Polish mafia. Anyways, when the fourth prosecutor was removed, the fifth one was appointed by the chief of the prosecution office in Wrocław. So many changes, and none of them seem to have been for the better. One would think that since the fifth prosecutor needed over a year to prepare himself for the trial, because like I said, Tomasz Komenda spent 18 months in remand prison, they're working on a solid indictment with his long list of witnesses, testimonies, tests they carried out, and so on and so forth. Because bear in mind, there is a difference between having enough evidence to only arrest someone, or even have the person locked up in remand prison on suspicion of murder, and having enough evidence to prolong the arrest, and finally, having enough evidence to have the suspect sent trial to be convicted. In reality, though, whatever the previous four prosecutors came up with, the fifth prosecutor just summed up together, without even reading the files thoroughly, and God only knows what he was doing until April of 2001, except for prolonging the custody period for Tomasz Komenda every 3 months or so. After a year spent in jail, before even standing trial and being convicted, Komenda finally heard from the prosecutor that the indictment in his case was ready to be presented in court. But not immediately. The first hearing took place on the 9th of October 2001. So for a year and a half, Tomasz Komenda stayed in jail without a sentence, just waiting for trial. The first time he was allowed to see his family was about 9 months after the arrest, and it was literally just seeing them through the glass window with a phone on two sides, like you see in movies. Tomasz and his mom weren't able to talk. They were just both howling and crying, looking at each other, unable to wrap their heads around the situation they were in. Like, how did this even happen? All of a sudden, Teresa found out that her son was arrested for something she couldn't imagine he could have done. And she was completely powerless. She couldn't get him out of it. She couldn't see him for 9 months. They had never been apart for so long before, and she kept finding out new things about her son. Things she knew were not true. And I know what it sounds like. A boy mom who tries to protect her son at all cost, refusing to believe he could do anything wrong. But with Tomasz Komenda, it really wasn't like that. He spent his entire life around his family, who always knew where he was and with whom, who protected him because they knew that he was in fact a little different than his brothers, which is why Mr. Rota loved calling him a retard. He was very young when the arrest happened and acted as if he was even younger, like a boy in a body of a young man. Before the trial, Tomasz Komenda was examined by psychologists and psychiatrists, and it was stated that he was not mentally impaired. He wasn't a genius. He struggled at school, but his IQ wasn't below the norm. It was said, however, that his personality was uncomplicated, whatever that means, and that he was immature for his age, both emotionally and socially. No mental health assessment, however, confirmed any mental or personality disorders like psychopathy or sociopathy, or sadism. As you remember, the person responsible for the death of Małgosia Kwiatkowska was supposed to be a sadist, and based on what was done to her, I 100% agree. That was sadism. But did this match Komenda's personality? Not really. Even his mom admitted that he was a bit of a wet sock, so to speak. There was no reason, no situation from the past that would allow calling Tomasz Komenda a sadist. I would understand if the family didn't see him that way or didn't want to see him that way, but there was no information in the sources I found that Komenda was described as a sadist by any mental health professional. The word sadist only turned up in the police memo, the one from 1999 that started the whole thing about the Komenda family. And we know where this information came from. Why did Ms. Dorota call him this way then? Where did she get it from? Unless it wasn't her words, or unless she was instructed on how to testify so that it fitted the situation. Let's get to the trial now. Like I said, the indictment was ready to be presented in court in April 2001, whereas the first hearing took place later, on the 9th of October that year. The prosecutor charged Tomasz Komenda with a brutal sexual assault, not a murder, which the parents of Małgosia Kwiatkowska, Jadwiga and Krzysztof, didn't agree with and demanded Komenda be charged with murder. I completely understand them. Just as Mr. Kwiatkowski said, our daughter was raped, bitten, tortured, kicked so hard with boots that the runner prints were visible all over her body. Then she was stripped naked and left unconscious in the snow in a sub-zero temperature. This was a murder. Actually, there is a part of the statement that is not entirely true, and I hope Mr. Kwiatkowski simply didn't know about this because it would make the whole situation even worse. Małgosia wasn't left unconscious after the attack. In fact, the forensic team stated that there were most likely two parts of the attack. The first one, when the girl was raped but not beaten up yet. After the rape, she most likely tried to get dressed. And then something happened. We don't know what it was, but something that made the attackers very angry, and the girl was not only raped once again, very brutally, but also was being hit and kicked all over her body and then transferred from one part of the yard to another. It was speculated that the attackers tried to hide her in a barn, but for some reason they gave that idea up and left her outside. When they walked away, Małgosia was still conscious, and we know that because there were trails on the ground that indicated that the girl was crawling around the yard, probably trying to get to the house to get help. The doctor who carried out the autopsy said that there was still a chance to save her for 2, maybe 3 hours after the attack. If only someone heard her. If only someone cared. For now, however, what the prosecution is trying to prove to the court is a brutal sexual attack, and I keep saying brutal because it matters for the Polish criminal code. The punishment for, I'm sorry I call it this way, but nothing better comes to my mind, a standard rape is minimum 2 years imprisonment, up to 15 years, whereas if it's a brutal attack, the punishment starts at 5 years, up to a life imprisonment. However, side note, at the time of the trial, the maximum punishment was 25 years imprisonment. Małgosia's father, Mr. Kwiatkowski, was an auxiliary prosecutor in his daughter's case, and both he and Małgosia's mom were sitting on a bench next to the state prosecutor during the trial. I can't even begin to imagine how hard it must have been for them, sitting there and listening to testimonies of witnesses who most likely heard their daughter's cries for help and did nothing, or the testimony of the coroner who summed up the post-mortem report. And I'm not surprised there were moments when Jadwiga and Krzysztof Kwiatkowski were losing their cool. Małgosia's mom would be verbally aggressive towards Tomasz Komenda, calling him names, so to speak, and screaming at him, whereas Mr. Kwiatkowski allegedly tried to smuggle a knife into the courtroom once, which, thank God, was foiled by the court's security guards. My guess would be that since Tomasz Komenda was not charged with the murder, Małgosia's parents had not believed in true justice anymore, so they might have decided to inflict a punishment upon the murderer by themselves. During the first hearing, the judge confirmed that there was a legal possibility of changing the rape charge to a murder charge. The defendant, Tomasz Komenda, pleaded not guilty to both. He didn't say much during the entire trial. Not that he didn't want to, but this is what his lawyer advised him. Tomasz Komenda only read his statement out loud, in which he took back his last testimony, the one from the police station, in which he admitted he was in Miłoszyce on the night of the 31st of December 1996 and had an intercourse with a girl named Kasia. Komenda stated that he was forced to testify this way by the police officers who were threatening and beating him. That looked really bad. Well, his situation in general looked really bad. For example, the fact that it looked as if Komenda kept changing his mind about what he knew about the death of Małgosia. Because as you remember, in the beginning he said he knew nothing about it. He'd never been to Miłoszyce. He presented an alibi for the night of the murder. But then, during the second arrest and interrogation, he signed a testimony containing an entirely different version of events. That testimony even included an explanation as to why he didn't want to admit earlier that he was in Miłoszyce. He was afraid of the police, probably after the first arrest and the interrogations of his entire family. And then we have a trial, at which Tomasz Komenda pretty much says nothing more than, "I didn't do it. I said I did it earlier because the police forced me to." Would you believe him? I know I wouldn't, especially if I were a grief-stricken parent or an average newspaper reader, because the press reporting the trial mostly focused on what the prosecution had to say, not the defense. Nobody wanted to defend a man against whom there was so much strong evidence proving that he cruelly hurt a 15-year-old girl, and then stay silent. They don't want to explain anything, just like his mother, who was also advised not to testify during the trial. The reasoning behind this was simple. The lawyer figured that they might get too emotional or angry and make things worse. Also, Teresa Klemańska, the mother of Tomasz Komenda, was told that if either one of them loses their temper in court, they might be forbidden visits in jail. It was hard to stay quiet, though, especially in those moments when the things they would hear in court they knew were straight-up lies, like the entire testimony of Miss Dorota. Are you curious about how the confrontation went in court when Tomasz Komenda and his mother got to see this one for the first time in a few years? Well, there was no confrontation. Miss Dorota said she was too scared to testify in front of the defendant, so she requested a hearing at home, which she was granted. That is very odd to me because even though sometimes witnesses do testify at their homes and the judge and the rest of the crew actually sit in someone's living room as if it was a courtroom and the trial is proceeded as normal, it happens very rarely, usually when someone is very ill, bedridden, and really unable to go to court and testify there. Miss Dorota wasn't ill, at least not physically, and yet she was granted a home hearing. Her testimony was not in any way interesting. We already know it all too well, but you might want to know that her dog peed on the carpet, running between the legs of the judge, the prosecutor, and the lawyer of Tomasz Komenda. The rest of the witnesses weren't too scared to testify in court. Admittedly, though, the emotions got the best of some people. Maybe it was the atmosphere of the courtroom, or the case itself, or the fact that for years, no one involved was allowed to finally close this chapter and move on. Whichever it was, some of the witnesses, like Krzysztof, the boy who accompanied Małgosia for the most of the New Year's Eve night, were clearly sick and tired of the whole thing. His testimony surprised me the most when I first read it because what he said, or I should rather say yelled in the courtroom, was that it was Tomasz Komenda who took Małgosia that night, claiming he was her brother and that Komenda ruined his life. This whole thing ruined his life. Because remember, Krzysztof was the first suspect in this case. He also got beaten up at the police station. And many people for years thought that he was responsible for Małgosia's death. Even though the polygraph test results suggested that he might know who did this, but he was not a perpetrator, plus the fact that Krzysztof had no marks of violence on his body, no fresh scratches or bruises, which he would have should he have attacked Małgosia. The judge gave Krzysztof a moment after his testimony because Krzysztof was crying and he was definitely not in a good place mentally at that moment. And then Krzysztof was asked, "Are you sure this is the man who took Małgosia away that night?" To which Krzysztof finally replied, "No, I only said this because he's sitting there as a defendant in this case." Nobody recognized Tomasz Komenda. Nobody could remember seeing him at the disco, but in fairness, the trial was taking place a few years after the murder, and witnesses didn't remember the details of their testimonies from 1997. But nobody tried to undermine their credibility, as opposed to the credibility of the defense witnesses. The Komenda family members and their friends who spent New Year's Eve of 1986 together all confirmed that Tomasz never left the flat, except for those 10 minutes when they all went to see the fireworks at midnight. Hearing this, however, the prosecutor accused them all of lying and advised them on the possibility of conviction for false testimony. The fact that Tomasz Komenda was in Miłoszyce village on the night of the murder was, according to the prosecution, 100% proven, so it was obvious for the prosecutor and Małgosia's parents that a bunch of people testifying in favor of Tomasz Komenda were simply trying to protect him. And this could be absolutely true. Many families would do the same thing for their loved one. But the thing here is that the prosecutor, he and those 4 previous ones, completely fudged up this entire investigation, along with police officers. And then, years after Małgosia died, all they managed to do was half-ass an indictment act, which contained nothing, and creating it took forever, Then they took it to court and accused anyone whose testimony didn't line with their made-up version of events of lying, and thereby showed utter lack of respect for the victim and her family, not to mention the judicial system, especially since we're talking about such a severe crime. Now let's just go over this indictment act. Having listed the charges against the defendant, the prosecutor continued to depict the whole story step by step, starting with the worried parents, Jadwiga and Krzysztof Kwiatkowski, reporting that their 15-year-old daughter Małgosia went missing after the New Year's Eve party. There is no point in telling you what happened once again. You already know how and when Małgosia was found, what kind of injuries she suffered. The prosecutor explained that the injuries the victim had suggested that the death was not of natural causes and therefore the investigation must have been opened. Based on that investigation, the prosecution was able to reconstruct the most probable chain of events. Well, we'll see about that. The story went back to the evening of the 31st of December 1986, Małgosia's arrival at the party and how she spent it, including her company and alcohol consumption on that night. The witnesses testified that the victim spent most of the night with Krzysztof, a boy whom she met that night. Since Małgosia didn't feel well, she and her new acquaintance would leave the disco building a few times that night so that the girl could either be sick or get some fresh air. During one of those trips outside, the couple was approached by a young man who introduced himself as Irek, Małgosia's brother. According to the witness, Irek seemed upset about the state his alleged sister was in and decided to take Małgosia home, as he said. The last time Krzysztof saw Małgosia was in front of the disco building when she and her brother walked away together. Then they were joined by a third person and disappeared somewhere around the our family's yard. This is, of course, where the prosecutor was quoting Krzysztof's testimony, but as you remember, there were two versions of this testimony, from before and after the brain edema. Apparently, the prosecutor decided to stick with the before brain edema version. Wondering why? Because if he decided to close the investigation at the beginning of 1987, he could have done it based on what Krzysztof said in his second testimony, in which he admitted to having sex with Małgosia that night. It doesn't matter that it wasn't true. Truth was the last thing the prosecution cared about in this case. Moving on, the prosecutor listed all the evidence collected at the crime scene, like the victim's clothes, other pieces of clothing that did not belong to the victim. By that I mean a black woolen hat that contained a few hairs, a shoelace, a watch, also samples of bodily fluids, not only from the place where Małgosia was found, but also from a few meters away when she was most likely hurt and then either was moved or crawled to the place where she was found. The autopsy later confirmed that there was no sperm found in or on the body of Małgosia. It also confirmed that the attack on the girl was exceptionally brutal, which already indicated that it took a certain kind of person to do all those horrible things to another human being. Listening to that part of the indictment act was horrible for both parties. I mean, the parents of Małgosia who were sitting there and listening what was done to their child, as well as to the family of Tomasz Komenda, especially his mother, who was expected to believe that her son was able to hurt someone so badly in such a disgusting way. The prosecutor continued that basic toxicology tests were carried out and there was no signs of the most popular drugs in the tissues of the victim, only some alcohol. Based on the autopsy report, it was concluded that the cause of Małgosia's death was exsanguination followed by hypothermia. And then, as if summing up the introduction part, the indictment act stated vaguely that the evidence listed above, combined with the police's operational work, led the investigators to believe that the person responsible for the death of Małgorzata Kwiatkowska was Tomasz Komenda, who was arrested on the 18th of April 2000. How did we get from point A to point B? How come there was no explanation as to what this operational work actually was? Why does it look as if a random person was chosen and then evidence tailored so that it looked as if Komenda was guilty? It was speculated that when Komenda was arrested for the first time, he was put in a cell with someone who was supposed to get information about the murder from Tomasz and then pass it on to the prosecutor. This way the cellmate would get a deal with the prosecution in their own case. It doesn't mean that the information, if any, that was passed to the prosecutor was true, but it wouldn't have to be true, only incriminating. There's also an option that under the term operational work, they meant getting information from Ms. Dorota, but then why not disclose this? They already had this whole cover story made with her seeing Komenda's face on TV. Well, the drawing of his face, to be specific. Plus, Ms. Dorota was one of the prosecution's witnesses and testifies at the trial, albeit at home. Having done the operational work, whatever it was, the police, following the prosecutor's indictment, managed to find and arrest Tomasz Komenda. Then there's my favorite part. The prosecutor stating in the indictment that they were almost sure it was Komenda who hurt Małgosia Kwiatkowska, and the evidence they carried out only confirmed this. Do you know what the problem here is? The police, supervised by the prosecutor, are supposed to conduct an investigation following possible leads. Not one lead. They have to rule out as many possibilities as they can, and under no circumstances stick to one theory from the start, which, as it seems, is exactly what happened here. What the prosecutor stated in his indictment somewhat proves it. They had a theory and only carried out the tests that were supposed to confirm it, but then it actually got worse because the test results didn't actually confirm what they were supposed to. Take the DNA test results. We've already been through this many times. The DNA expert at the trial said that the polymarker method was dated, and these days it's only mentioned briefly in med schools as a fun fact, that in ancient times there was something like this. We already know that these few markers are not specific to one person. The lawyer of Tomasz Komenda said that in Wrocław only, there could be about 10,000 people with the same 6 markers in their DNA. But if that doesn't convince you, I need to tell you that in the previous episode, I made a mistake. I said there was another DNA test available, but it was too expensive to carry out. It was an empty DNA test, and, as it turned out, it was made for the trial's purposes. Actually, the first person whose DNA was tested with this method was Krzysztof, the boy who accompanied Małgosia on the night she died. Also, his best friend Andrzej was tested, and another boy mentioned as Krzysztof and Andrzej's friend. Komenda was the 4th person whose DNA was checked, and guess what? A much more specific DNA test came out negative. The hairs from the crime scene did not belong either to Krzysztof, Andrzej, their friend, or Tomasz Komenda. Did the judge care? Nope. Seems like this whole DNA thing was completely dismissed because to judge the most convincing evidence was the jaw print. As I told you earlier, the judge, when the verdict was already reached, explained that human teeth arrangement is so specific that there was no point in arguing that someone else could have left those prints on Małgosia's body. Normally I would agree. I would agree if all teeth, or at least the vast majority of them, matched the prints from the victim's body. That wasn't the case here. What the experts worked with were incorrectly taken pictures, which were compared with the suspect's lower jaw, not both the lower jaw and upper jaw. The expert determined that the suspect's 6 teeth matched the prints. To battle this, Tomasz Komenda's attorney asked for help from the local med school and managed to find about 6 other jaws, like preserved body parts, that matched the prints, to no avail. So then we have the last piece of evidence that I have to admit was very convincing to me when I first read about the case. The smell from the crime scene. Well, from the hat left at the crime scene, to be specific. A black woolen hat that was put in a jar and kept in it for years for scent purposes. I believed in this evidence because dogs can't lie. They can make a mistake. But there were 2 dogs, and the test was carried out a few times in a different combinations. And the dogs always pointed at the right jar. But did they? How do we know that the test looked the way I described it earlier? How do we know that dogs pointed at jars with Komenda's scent? Because this whole test was never recorded. Komenda wasn't in the room with the dogs, only police officers were. And about Komenda, there was also no written or signed record on how the scent from his hand was retrieved. Also no description on how the hat from the crime scene was preserved back in 1997. We don't know how it was done, if it was done correctly, how it was stored later. And there's one more thing. Do you remember how Tomasz Komenda was taken for the test? One day the police officers arrived at his place and told him, "We're going for a ride, jump in." So he did. He didn't resist, he didn't ask any questions. He was dealing with the police, so he knew he must obey. The ride to Głogów, where the test took place, lasted 2 hours. Komenda didn't know where he was going and what for. Is it hard to imagine that the hat was there, on the back seat, for 2 hours next to a completely clueless suspect? I know it's a wild shot, but so many weird and questionable things happened in this case that I wouldn't be surprised. So in theory, the dogs could have pointed at the right jar, but the question is, how Komenda's scent got on the hat? There's also a possibility that the dogs pointed at different jars, but since we have no video evidence on how the test was carried out, it cannot be proven today. Going further with the indictment, the prosecutor stated that the suspect was interrogated for the first time in April 2000, and he did not confess to the attack on Małgosia. But in fact, as you remember, Tomasz Komenda was arrested and interrogated for the first time, and then his full family, in November 1999. Why did the prosecutor leave that part out? We don't know. Next, the prosecutor stated that during his interrogation in April 2000, Komenda confessed to having been to Miłoszyce, where he went to a disco with his friend and met a girl there, with whom he had sex later on in an undisclosed place. We know this version already. It was made up by the police, and the prosecutor reused it. He only changed that part about where Komenda went with his new girlfriend. The original version was that they went to a small forest or something like that. There was no such thing in the area, so maybe someone brought the prosecutor's attention to that detail, and it was changed. There was also no night bus that would take Tomasz Komenda to Miłoszyce on New Year's Eve. We already know that too. But do you know what the prosecutor did with that part? He sort of used it against Komenda. This made-up version of events, the one where Komenda allegedly said he took a bus to Miłoszyce, was quoted as an official suspect's testimony, against which the prosecutor wrote that the police eventually thought of checking the timetables and interrogating the bus drivers, and there was no bus available that night. So Komenda was lying. He couldn't take a bus. Like, wow. This is exactly what I was saying. And I was speechless when I first read it. The next logical thing would be to explain how Komenda got to Miłoszyce, as this is crucial because if the prosecutor doesn't prove Komenda was there, then subsequently he cannot prove that Tomasz was guilty of hurting Małgosia. But the prosecutor didn't bother proving anything. He pretty much only said Komenda couldn't take a bus. No alternative ideas, means of transport, nothing. Maybe he teleported. Who knows? Does it even matter? What mattered more to the prosecutor was the fact that Komenda called off his words about having gone to Miłoszyce on the night of the 31st of December, 1996, and stated he would no longer answer any questions. This is more or less where the indictment ended. 18 months worth of work. The trial lasted for 2 years, and the pressure on the judge was high, but given how many witnesses had to be interrogated and the evidence presented, it seemed impossible to speed things up. Pretty much everyone except for the defendant and his family was convinced that the right person had been caught and was about to get convicted, hopefully for the longest possible sentence. The question was, what would Tomasz Komenda be convicted of? A brutal sexual attack or a murder? The prosecutor charged him with SA and demanded 12 years imprisonment for the defendant. However, since the father of the victim was an auxiliary prosecutor in this case, he was also allowed to demand a certain verdict for Tomasz Komenda, and it didn't have to be the same as the state prosecutors, even though they're both on the same side. And as you can imagine, the father, along with Małgosia's family lawyer, the same pro bono attorney that had been helping them from the beginning, demanded life imprisonment, stating that Komenda should have been charged with murder. The verdict was pronounced on the 14th of November 2003, over 2 years after the trial had started. The judge agreed with the family of Małgosia that Tomasz Komenda should have been charged with murder, so he officially changed the qualification of the offense and sentenced Tomasz Komenda to 15 years imprisonment. To be honest with you, I don't understand this decision. The judge must have been very sure of the evidence he was presented with, since he said he had absolutely no doubt that the course of events set out by the prosecution was accurate. The judge expressed his outrage at the crime and stated that the perpetrators, in plural, the judge was perfectly aware that there was more than one attacker, yet nobody cared at that point about looking for arresting these men, that the perpetrators were absolutely vicious and depraved in their actions, and yet Tomasz Komenda, for a murder, only got 15 years in prison. from which he was supposed to serve about 12 years because his arrest time would have been taken into account. Why be so lenient then? Apparently, the fact that Komenda had no criminal record, plus his overall immaturity and pliancy, confirmed by mental health experts, mitigated the punishment. Of course, the prosecution and the family of Małgosia Kwiatkowska were very unhappy with the judge's decision and appealed the verdict. Małgosia's father said that, in fairness, only the death penalty would be satisfactory in this case, but he knew it was not possible. The lawyer of Tomasz Komenda also appealed the case, stating that based on the evidence presented in court by the prosecution, his client should have been acquitted. The appeal court verdict was reached on the 16th of June 2004, so a little over 6 months later, and over 7 years after Małgosia died. The appeal court judge agreed that Komenda should have been tried for the murder, that there was no doubt that he did this, and that 15 years in prison was not enough. The sentence was therefore changed from 15 to 25 years imprisonment. What convinced the judge the most about Tomasz Komenda being guilty of the murder was the jaw prints found on Małgosia's body and compared with the jaw of the defendant. Even though only the lower jaw was compared and only 6 teeth more or less matched, and the dental care specialist didn't say it was 100% Tomasz Komenda who left the prints, and the judge said that one doesn't have to be a specialist to know that one's teeth arrangement is absolutely unique, so to him, leaving a jaw print on the crime scene was like leaving one's signature. Also, the judge stated that he found the psychological profile of the defendant unconvincing and, to be honest, irrelevant. The defense lawyer tried to convince the court that Tomasz Komenda wasn't the type of person who was able to commit such a violent crime. The judge said that Komenda showed his true colors when committing the crime, and shortly after, he showed that he was not really such a wet sock as his family tried to portray him. This way of thinking is completely illogical to me, because the lawyer was trying to prove the defendant had not committed the crime, whereas the judge considered the defendant's behavior after the crime, which they still didn't know the defendant had committed, as proof that the crime was indeed committed by them. Do you understand what I mean? Like, I don't care how psychologists see him, I think he was able to rape and murder a 15-year-old girl because of how he acted when he was raping and killing a 15-year-old girl. It doesn't make sense, like many other things in the story. I hope you've already gotten used to it. When Tomasz Komenda realized that he was about to spend 25 years in prison, he wanted to hang himself. He was saved by one of his cellmates. Komenda's lawyer, as a last resort, filed for the annulment of the sentence to the Supreme Court. I don't know on what grounds. This motion is usually filed if there is something technically wrong with the trial or the verdict in the previous instance, for example, when the case was heard by a judge or a court that, as it later turns out, actually had no jurisdiction over the case, be it because of the severity of the crime or simply because of the place where the crime was committed. On the 12th of May 2005, the motion for annulment was denied by Supreme Court. The case was over. Well, at least this one. Because there was another trial running in the background. Do you remember when I told you that there were 2 other essay cases in the Jelczaskowice area that happened in the summer of 1986, a few months before Małgosia was attacked? One woman actually managed to escape, helped by some passers-by. However, the other one was hurt twice the same night. First by the unknown man, then this unknown man was scared away by a passerby who initially, as he said, wanted to help the hurt woman, but when he saw her half naked, he got aroused and hurt her too. The quote-unquote helpful passerby was later caught by the police, but there was still a matter of this other one, because as it turned out, the man who tried to hurt the first woman and the man who attacked the second woman, then got scared away by the passerby, was most likely one and the same person. The conclusion was drawn based on the way both attacks were carried out, also the place where they happened, the time, the fact that the first attack failed, so it seemed that the attacker wanted to try again shortly after. Also, the witnesses saw a blonde guy running away from both scenes and a white Fiat 126B parked nearby in both situations. The second woman went to the police and told them what happened to her. From what I read, I understand that the police caught the helpful passerby, as I will continue to call him, quite quickly, since he was known to the police, probably due to his previous criminal activity. He admitted that he had had an intercourse with the attacked woman, although, unsurprisingly, he tried to convince everyone that it was consensual. You know, Shortly after the first attack, the woman was supposed to willingly say yes to another intercourse. I swear the concentration of dangerous and disgusting men in this case is just terrifying. Then after the guy's confession, the police organized an identity parade, and the hurt woman immediately and without hesitation pointed at the helpful passerby and confirmed that he was the second person who hurt her that awful August night in 1996. Now what about this other perpetrator, the blonde one, probably driving in a white Fiat 126B that still had not been caught at that point? Well, nothing happened. Both cases, the attack attempt and the first attack on the second woman, were not resolved. At least until 1999, when Tomasz Komenda was pointed at as the person responsible for hurting Małgosia Kwiatkowska. Then the same female prosecutor, or prosecutor trainee at the time, remembered that there were other attacks on women in the same area within about 6 months, and she figured those 3 cases could be linked. Now that was good thinking. But what happened next was not in any way good. The prosecutor requested the DNA samples collected from the underwear of the second SA victim, the one who got hurt twice the same night, to be compared with the DNA of Tomasz Komenda. Of course, the polymarker method was used, and of course, the same 6 markers were found in the DNA of the perpetrator and the DNA of Tomasz Komenda. Apparently, though, the same 6 markers can be found in every 1 in 70 people, so potentially it could be a few people, even in one small village, not to mention a town or city. The last thing left to do in this case was to organize an identity parade at the police station once again. This time, Tomasz Komenda was in a group of men standing in front of the one-way mirror, and the attack woman was called to the station and asked to identify her first attacker. This time, however, the woman did not recognize anyone. She was adamant that none of the men she saw on the other side of the mirror was the one who tried to hurt her. And she said she was sure about this because she saw the attacker's face, and even after 3 years, she had not forgotten it. In this situation, surprisingly, the prosecution dropped the case without charging Tomasz Komenda for the sexual assault from 1996 because the DNA proof was considered insufficient in this case, just too weak. But then it wasn't too weak in Małgosia's case. But okay, let's move on, because that's not all. When Tomasz Komenda was eventually arrested for the assault of Małgosia Kwiatkowska in April of 2000, the prosecutor's office in Wrocław, which handled the Miłoszyce case, requested access to the files on the summer 1996 assault case, the one that was dropped, from the prosecutor's office in Oława. That summer 1996 assault case was handled by the prosecution in Oława, which is why it's known as the Oława case. Oława is a town about 30 kilometers away from Wrocław and about 10 kilometers away from Mielec, where Małgosia Kwiatkowska came from, and where 2 women were attacked in 1996. The access to the files was granted, and then for a long while, nothing happened. To sum it all up, the prosecution in Wrocław was handling the case of Małgosia Kwiatkowska, and at the same time, they were in possession of the files on the dropped assault case from 1996. At the beginning of 2002, the prosecution office from Wrocław wrote a letter to the prosecution office in Oława that they were returning the files on the dropped assault case, but at the same time, they were pointing out, as if the office in Oława had no idea, that the DNA found on the underwear of the victim from the 1996 case and the DNA found at the crime scene in the case of Małgosia Kwiatkowska, retrieved from a few hairs left on the by the attacker, were compared with the DNA of Tomasz Komenda using the polymarker method, and 6 markers matched. Like I said, the prosecution's office in Oława already knew that, but decided not to charge Komenda since they found this particular DNA proof to be too weak, and there was no other proof that he did this. It was also not recognized by the victim. But the prosecutor from Wrocław continued in his letter that his discovery should be treated by the prosecutor from Oława as his cue to reopen the 1996 case. Then he added that Komenda was currently in remand prison, so pretty much at anyone's disposal. I can't be the only person who sees this as a hint, kind of a wink towards the prosecutor from Oława, encouraged by his colleague from Wrocław to rethink his decision on one of his cases. It's quite easy to see how much charging and sentencing Komenda for the 1996 assault, maybe even 2 assaults if someone tried to prove that this first woman was also attacked by Komenda, how much this would help the prosecutor from Wrocław in the Małgosia Kwiatkowska murder case. That would pretty much make Tomasz Komenda a serial rapist. What a dream come true. So unfortunately, following that letter, in March 2002, the prosecutor from Oława reopened the 1999 investigation and charged Tomasz Komenda with an essay of the woman who was attacked twice on the same night and did not recognize him as her attacker during the first investigation. There wasn't much the prosecutor had to do in this case, since most of the evidence was collected in 1999. Absolutely nothing changed ever since. Plus, things like a mental health assessment, background survey on Komenda and his family could have been taken from the investigation on the murder of Małgosia Kwiatkowska. But they were probably wondering in Oława what they should do about the fact that the victim had not recognized her attacker. But that problem got resolved by the victim herself. The trial started in January of 2003, which was 10 months before the verdict on Małgosia's case was reached, because bear in mind that at that time the trial for the Miłoszyce case was still going in the background. When Tomasz Komenda was brought to court, escorted by prison guards, because as you remember he had already been in remand prison for years at that point, he saw Małgosia's mother, Mrs. Jadwiga Kwiatkowska, waiting outside the courtroom, accompanied by an unknown to Komenda woman. As it later turned out, once the indictment act was read out loud to the defendant, who pleaded not guilty to the charges, the woman from the court corridor was the essay victim from the summer of 1996. The woman he was supposed to know, or at least recognize. The woman who, in 1999, was 100% sure that none of the men presented to her during the identity parade, including Tomasz Komenda, was the one who attacked her. But in 2003, almost 7 years after a brutal and traumatizing attack, and after meeting at least one parent of, as everyone thought, another victim of Tomasz Komenda, and I mean Mrs. Kwiatkowska, Małgosia's mom, the essay victim changed her mind. In court, she said that she actually wasn't so sure that it wasn't Tomasz Komenda who attacked her. Now she is sure that it was him because she remembered that her attacker had hollow eyes and was very thin. When asked why she testified indifferently in 1999, she said she didn't have much time to look at his eyes. Which is odd because for whatever reason, the victim was shown Tomasz Komenda twice. First during the identity parade at the police station when he was in a group of other men, and then again when she was brought to remand prison when he was already arrested and waiting for the trial of the murder case. And to be honest, I'm not sure if on the second occasion Komenda was also accompanied by other men or if he was being identified alone. Regardless though, the essay victim did not recognize him, and a few years later, she claimed that despite 2 identity parades, she didn't have enough time to look at the suspect's face to tell if his eyes were hollow enough. The other perpetrator, the helpful passerby as I called him earlier, was also called to testify during the trial, but he didn't have much to say. He didn't recognize Komenda. I mean, he did, but from television, as someone who had been charged for assaulting a 15-year-old girl, not as someone who tried to attack a woman shortly before the witness himself did the same thing. This trial ended on the 23rd of December 2004, whereas the verdict in the case of Małgosia Kwiatkowska was reached in November 2003, and then the appeal verdict in June 2004. That order of verdicts must have been a bit frustrating to the prosecution office in Wrocław, since the essay case from Oława was supposed to be resolved first and work like grist the mill of the Miłoszyce case. It didn't happen though. Both verdicts in the Miłoszyce case were reached earlier, and since Tomasz already knew he was spending the next 25 years in prison, I don't think he really cared that much about the verdict in the Oława case. Everyone, except for his family, considered him a rapist and a murderer anyway, which is why he tried to end his life in prison. He was deeply depressed and defeated, and I'm sure that if it wasn't for his mom and brothers, Tomasz Komenda wouldn't have survived jail. The initial 4-year imprisonment verdict for the essay from the 1996 didn't change much in Komenda's situation. The judge said that what convinced them the most about Tomasz Komenda being guilty of the assault was the DNA, even though the DNA specialist explained in court that the polymarker method was more than insufficient, that it was dated, that in many people's DNA the same markers can be found, but the judge trusted the polymarker test. They also pointed out that the DNA wasn't the only evidence in this case, that there were witnesses that saw Komenda at the scene. I don't know what witnesses, I only know about the victim of the attack that changed her mind after a few years. Plus, and that really got me when I read about it, the judge in the Oława case quoted the testimony of Miss Dorota from Miłoszyce case. Exactly that part where, allegedly, Tomasz Komenda was supposed to borrow money from Miss Dorota for bus tickets to Jelcz, where the attacks happened. It was so ridiculous that the lawyer of Tomasz Komenda obviously appealed the case, but another trial and then another verdict were not to be reached for the next few years. But something good finally happened in 2007, a small win considering the entire situation, but still. The appeal worked in the Joława case. Tomasz Komenda was acquitted of assaulting a woman in the summer of 1996. This time, the argument that 1 in 70 people can have the same 6 markers in their DNA got to the judge, who also was not convinced by the latest testimony of the assault victim who, given such chance twice, did not recognize the defendant as her attacker, especially when her memory was still relatively fresh in the 90s. The most ironic part here is that Tomasz Komenda was acquitted of an essay based on the same DNA proof that got him in jail for 25 years in a murder case. And nobody cared about that. Nobody looked into this. Somewhere in the meantime, Mrs. Teresa Klemańska, Tomek's mom, figured that they could also try to fight for justice in the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. It was that time in Polish history when everybody was talking about her access to the EU in 2004, so maybe that's why this thought came to her mind. She managed to fill out an application, but then it turned out that it exceeded the time limit. I don't know if it was any different back then, but right now it's 4 months since the final decision is reached in a domestic court, so I believe the deadline was on the 12th of September 2005, because the Supreme Court's decision to uphold the appeal court verdict was taken on the 12th of May that year. The case was over. There was nothing else they could do. Tomasz Komenda and his family realized that he would always be a convicted rapist and a murderer, and that he wouldn't leave prison until he was a middle-aged man. For a 20-something-year-old, realizing that must have been crushing. But Tomasz Komenda couldn't have known that one day, a police officer would move to Miłoszyce. A police officer who had absolutely nothing to do with this case. Which is probably why he, of all people, one day will be able to make Tomasz Komenda a free man again. It will only take 6,540 days. To be continued.